Oh snap, this beat is too hard, babe. I take lots of risks. I take shots and miss, yeah, I'm not known for incompetence. In fact, it is quite the opposite. I shot out present for that 5%. Face consequence to build confidence. And I'm bound to fall, but I'm bound to rise. It's just Father God to my entourage. I'm like Maharajas. Radio and Mags won't plug the God, but can't plug the Gaza. Throwing the bar, then wonder why they aren't none the wiser. Never mind the fact that it's nothing like an act, so I don't rehearse. I'm like Samson in reverse. And boy, Sam made me into the introverts. I go hard. Don't follow me online, I gave energy to Dapple for a long time. Every morning I know one is an all kind, so if you're looking for the norm, you got the wrong guy. If you're looking for a fad, you got the wrong lad. And if you're looking for the same, you caught the wrong train. If you're looking for a hack, I'll never write back. But if you're looking for the champ, you found the right chap. And if you're looking for the ace, you're in the right place. He's a producer that tracks, you're on the right track. In fact, if you have any taste, you'll make a screw face and flavor you could never squeeze. You need a spice rack. I'm safe in the space that I presently take up, and I prefer to live a dream rather than wake up. So when you pat me on the head, you better say duck or go hard.
The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D. The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D. The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D. The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D.
I soak in sun, breathe out sky. Boy scenes in the building. Now I much prefer to be outside. I have an inquiry in mind for the rookies and veterans, ladies and gentlemen. Whatever guy you know, 6'5", not at all menacing, as well versed in indigenous medicine. Been a while, learned a couple things about life in general. Been around, used to never wear jeans fit better now. Raving and ranting, I'm like Fred Hampton, chewing on rattlesnake planting. In other words, I go hard. I'm not scared to cry, I'm not scared to die. I'm not scared of heights. But I'm scared of trying, I'm scared of can't, and I'm scared of might. That's right, I cannot stand breathing air that's not rarefied. I like my media rare. I don't like anything medium rare fried. Bear in mind, try the other side and I couldn't bear it. Living with a barren mind, said goodbye. Praise divine that this brain of mine is on rain or shine. Keep that matter undermined, I will not be undermined. Write this down, then underline, I go hard.
The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D. The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D. The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D. The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D.
One more thing, some more string, theory, freshly matured, fresh chimichurri. Pets might leave cemeteries, would-be priests might leave seminary. I am my own judge and jury, what luxury. Without knowledge of the self, there is nothing more dreary than the universe of the 21st century. So, I do not worry, it is not at all necessary. I ain't back off of meat and dairy, think I might do it till I'm dead and buried. I'm not here to monitor the commentary, I don't have time for the Tom and Jerry. Much to the contrary, I go hard. Harder still, I'm hard to kill. I go hard wearing big shoes, no one has a chance to fill. I go so hard, Congress tried to pass a bill. It didn't pass, but still. If you ever see me lay back and chill instead of going for a blast, cause I haven't will. And I'd stop smell daffodils, okay, done. Let's have fun. Three's too much on account of one. Not go hard on account of what? That sounds dumb. Duh. Otherwise I'm bored. Let me be straightforward, let me keep this short. You can rest assured. I go hard.
The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D. The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D. The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D. The G, the O, the A, the A, the R, the D.
All right, welcome guys. It is another Tuesday. Time for another Note to File Live. It's been a little while. You guys, Sfera, good to see you. Just saw you about an hour ago. How's it going, man?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's fun, man. It's been busy, but I'm on today. Glad to be here. It's been a while.
Yeah, good to see you. Sorry, this is bothering me. All right, our guest today, I'm excited to talk to Chris. Chris, how's it going, man?
Good, Brad. How are you doing? Thanks for having me. Yeah,
of course. I know we've exchanged messages here and there over the years. Glad to finally have you on. And just like everybody comes on, tell us a bit about yourself. It's always fun to hear people's kind of backgrounds in this industry.
Can I start by saying long-time listener, first-time caller?
Appreciate that.
No, it's nice to be on this side of the camera. So I bit of background. I started out in the industry in the late 90s. We was with Wyeth prior to the acquisition by Pfizer. Actually, I started with Pfizer with Wyeth in the UK. I was working on infectious disease vaccines. It was the Flumist nasal spray that some people will remember. that was a program that went exceptionally well in the UK, and we couldn't understand why it wasn't. We weren't seeing the same results in the US. So they ended up bringing part of the UK team over to the Pearl River, New York office, and sort of integrating us with the US team and trying to figure out how we did things and why the results looked so different. That was supposed to be one flu season, sort of 6 to 8 months maximum, and I ended up sticking around. It was more luck of the draw, I think. I was put on transferring technology and regulatory data from the Wyeth organization down to MedImmune in Gaithersburg, and that was sort of in the early 2000s. And then I moved down to Gaithersburg. I'm representing my Maryland shirt today, and worked in MedImmune.
Go Terps.
Through the acquisition by AstraZeneca. So that was about 15 years in Maryland. It was classic sort of biotech style, to take somebody out of what they knew, and that was, for me, infectious disease, clinical operations, vaccines, and drop me into the world of oncology. I learned like a roller coaster for those few years, but it was a really fascinating time, and I ended up writing clinical trial protocols at the AstraZeneca office for a while, and found that the best way for me to write the best protocol was to actually sit down with some of the investigators, some of the PIs that we were working with, and asking them, what do you think of this? How can we improve this? How will this work in your practice? And so that led me to having this passion for just connecting with sites and the providers, and figuring out a better way to do things. Eventually, I moved over to Covance right through the acquisition by LabCorp. That was an interesting time. And we started taking out clinical research as a care option to LabCorp partnered hospitals and health systems. And so they were providing this comprehensive health system support rather than just diagnostics or just clinical research. And the last 2 years of my career, I've spent with Javara at the IRO world, and expanding the footprint of the integrated research organization throughout the US, both through large hospitals, health systems, multi-physician practices, multi-specialty practices, but also into FQHCs as federally qualified health systems that really have been ignored, I think, for the most part for the last few years. And it's a real shame, because we've got patients in those systems that are desperately looking for clinical research options, for novel technologies, and they haven't been given the opportunity. And the doctors that are treating them haven't been given the opportunity to participate. So I just this year joined the board of directors of an FQHC close to my home, because I recognized the need for people locally with a knowledge of healthcare and hospitals and clinical research to step up and participate in those boards. And I have to say, it's been a really rewarding experience being involved in that. A bit of an eye opener, honestly.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, and I want to touch on, obviously, I know we have a lot of things to kind of pull out of there possibly. And one thing that's really interesting to me is sort of the rise of the IRO model, I guess, if you will. And man, I talk to a lot of people. We talk about sites versus site networks versus IROs versus SMOs. Like, how would you sort of distinguish, or what makes an IRO different than for example, a site network or even an SMO? Like, is there a good rule of thumb? Because again, I always
that's a really common question that's asked, and I think for me, the model includes the health system and the leadership of the health system, not just the providers within it. So, what essentially the IROs are offering is a risk mitigation for the system. The employed physicians don't necessarily have an opportunity to run off and run a study by themselves without the knowledge or input and the resources, frankly, from that health system. So it's really a three-party agreement that draws in not just the physician themselves and the biopharma company sponsor, but it brings in the IRO services that can be offered sort of centrally. And it brings in the legal team, the finance team, and the leadership team of that health system. So they can help the IROs roll it out a lot faster in theory than you would be able to just by going to single individual physicians in the field. Do you know that I think it's just the sort of the next step in a constantly evolving business. When I joined the industry back in the late 90s, we were actively going out to academic medical centers, and pretty much only academic medical centers, for vaccines work. Now, I can understand CROs and biopharma companies now going to those academic medical centers religiously. But when it comes to vaccines work, when it comes to infectious disease and should we say slightly perhaps easier to enroll studies, the enrollment that we see in community-based practices and the speed of activation of those sites is far and away better than we're going to ever see from the academic medical centers. And I apologize for anybody from a large hospital system that's listening in, but I think it's just a fact. We saw this shift in the 90s towards dedicated research sites. We saw AMR pop up, I think, in the kind of mid to late 90s, and someone's going to correct me on that, that sort of centralized this support network, this service. And then by the late 90s and early 2000s, we're seeing the rise of site management organizations. And then we saw networks start popping up after that. I think the IRO model has really accelerated based on the back of private equity. I think we're close to 32 different private equity venture capital companies that are investing in the industry now. Just in the last 6 years or so. Javara started just over 6 years ago. I think Circuit Clinical were around about the same time as well. But without that private equity money, I'm not sure that those companies would have been able to accelerate clinical research into the community in the way that they have been.
Yeah, I wonder about that. We can dig in further to that. I think that's a curious question, and I'm still curious if is private equity going to actually be good at the end of the day? Not that it's necessarily a black or white question. I know, Sfera, we've probably talked about this. I find it fascinating. We're integrated within a health system here in Oklahoma. I like what you said. You said it's easier in theory. I guess talk to me about that you've seen. I know for me, conceptually, it's an easy sell. To be like, hey, we're going to provide all the infrastructure. Yeah, we're going to bring clinical trials to you in a way to where it's stupidly easy for you to participate. But there's so many administrators in these places, so many people who just don't understand how clinical trials work, or see them as a liability versus the potential benefit there. I guess, can you talk at all about what you've seen, or is that fairly common? Is there a misunderstanding? And if so, how much are we still missing because there's still a lot of just uncertainty and misunderstanding about what clinical trials are?
Yeah, and I think that misunderstanding, that's a really great way to put it. That misunderstanding of what clinical trials are goes all the way up to the top of some of the biggest academic medical centers out there. I've spent the better part of the last 8 years meeting with executives at the C-suite level of some of the largest health systems in the country. And it's incredible to me that, when we go in and we sit down and we start talking about research, they start thinking along the lines of NIH studies, co-op studies, investigator-initiated studies. They don't necessarily think about the industry-sponsored work, which frankly is probably the most lucrative of all the work they can do. They've got a dedicated research administration team that are actively bringing in studies and running feasibility for biopharma companies. But, except in quite rare situations where you've got a very engaged chief medical officer who's been a PI in the past, the message doesn't get to the CEO, the COO, the CFO on the value of running clinical research in a large hospital or health system. And I think that's a real shame. There's a few ways that the message can resonate better, and I've seen people literally sort of sit upright in their seat and take notice when I've mentioned value-based care and the connection between offering clinical research as a care option and how it ties back to the value-based care business model that they're pursuing. A lot of the health systems are pursuing. Now, this all started coming about in 10 years ago or more with Obamacare. The payment mechanisms started to change, especially with Medicare and Medicaid initially, where hospitals were being reimbursed not just on how many patients they see, but on the outcomes of those patients. There's really 4 fundamental sort of pillars of value-based care. The outcomes is important, the reduction of per capita cost of healthcare, extremely important, especially to the CEO and the CFO of the hospital systems. Patient satisfaction and physician satisfaction, and a whole industry has been created around meeting those 4 milestones. And if I'm honest, I think from those 4 sort of pillars come all the factors that lead hospital executives to lay awake at night and wonder how they're going to fix problems. You've got massive staff turnover now more than ever in hospital systems, which is causing big problems. You've got, a real people don't realize that hospitals are on razor thin margins. And it's a very, very hard business to be in. In fact, I think what we've seen over the course of the last 8 to 10 years is hospitals are actually focusing now on their core competencies, which is really putting patients in beds, but getting them out of those beds as quickly as possible and getting somebody else in there. When I was at LabCorp, and they still are doing this, there's a very active move towards bringing LabCorp, bringing Quest in and running lab management contracts with them, where these third-party companies take on what the hospitals consider to not be a core competency in their business. We've seen the same with radiology services. We've seen the same with urgent care. And I've got to tell you guys, I really think that the clinical research industry should have taken a step forward and put themselves in the position where hospitals and health systems could partner strategically with CROs, perhaps, certainly SMOs and IROs, to provide clinical research services, as that is their core competency and it's not the hospitals. I think we can do a lot if we do that to push clinical research more into the community, the employed physicians out there in the field, than right now the hospitals have the bandwidth or perhaps the interest or the finances to be able to do themselves.
I mean, and in my experience, at least, I think there is more of a willingness to do that, at least in the systems that I've had conversations with. I mean, obviously, companies like Jabara and Circuit are out there, getting integrated into more and more. So I do think the hunger is there. And to your point too, I think it does serve that, we're in a system here, but they're all over the rural areas of Oklahoma, which are many. So, you do have access immediately at that point into getting clinical trials out of the big, city centers, so to speak, and out into the different rural communities, which again, I think is tough to do. Not impossible to do, but harder to do on sort of a 1-by-1, picking off like these independent practices, which is how I started. And, Dan, you're in an independent practice. Yeah.
Yeah. And let me tell you, we're in an underserved area. The margins for the hospital here are not thin at all. They found legal loopholes to exploit reimbursement rates. Sometimes I'm hearing 5x what for procedures what a private physician outside of the network would be able to charge. One of the things from Obamacare, I'm not an expert on hospital administration, but readmission rates is a very important metric, keeping those down. And so that has incentivized these systems to acquire outpatient clinics, which now you're not in the hospital business anymore. You're in managed care services. At least in my community and probably others around me, everything's insular with this group. They do their own research. Brad's in a unique situation where it's like a private-public partnership, whereas in my case, we had to do everything independent, and there's very few physicians left, especially specialists, to do it with, which is good and bad. I mean, I have the first mover advantage because there's really not many doctors left after I got the remaining independent ones to work with me. But the hospital control, they run the show, really. Interestingly enough, our research group is bigger than theirs, and they're huge. So it's
I wonder, I don't know,
they're not prioritizing.
I was going to say, and Chris, I don't know if you know at all, but I mean, I've worked in a hospital that had its own research group, and frankly, they lost a lot of money.
Yeah,
they really didn't do a particularly good job. And a lot of that is kind of going back to what you spoke to earlier, is sort of being bottom down versus top up, or a top down versus bottom up, rather, within that system, where they were like, here's research, you're going to do it. There's no advantage for you to do it, but here it is. And as a result, you just saw this group bleed money every year, which at that point becomes just a it is truly a liability, for the hospital, versus partnering with a group who knows what they're doing and obviously has maybe different, not strikingly different, but somewhat different incentive to actually accomplish a goal. So I'm curious.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen that or if that's been your experience.
Indicative of this industry in general. We've been fantastic at increasing the complexity of what we do, and that's especially true of large hospitals and health systems. We never take a step back and say, how can we simplify this? And sometimes it takes an organization like a private, research site or a network to actually say, how can we do this better? Who are we up against? And really, when those organizations started sort of appearing on the horizon, it was in their interests to take a look at how things are being done and make some significant efficiency improvements. And I think they've still got some to do. We still overcomplicate the world of research, especially at the site level. I feel bad every time I talk to a site and they've had to implement another technology tool in order to run a study. So I think there's some improvements we can still make. But ultimately, we've got to get more clinical trials out to more patients. And the hospital leadership teams agree with that. They know that if they've got, let's say, 6 hospitals, but they've got 2,000 affiliated physician practices within 200 miles of all their hospitals, they're offering an inconsistent level of care to the patients that are willing or able to get themselves to the research administration team at the hospital. But all those other patients don't have that opportunity. And only by pushing clinical research to those affiliated practices can you actually say, truthfully, that you're offering a consistent level of care wherever you are as a patient in that system. And the more that the system grows, the more that becomes necessary. It's a commitment to the patient.
Yeah, it's challenging, right? Though, I mean, even here where it's sort of a hospital/medical group where there are hundreds of clinics across the state, like how can you provide that consistent level of research opportunity? I know we're maybe we're on the verge of like some true DCT FDA guidance where maybe there's some healthcare provider integration or whatever you want to call it. I guess we're not quite there yet, but it's interesting. I mean, and I think maybe where we've seen some ventures stumble is trying to do too much at once instead of growing into those different, because I mean, let's be really honest, unfortunately a lot of this is still run by what's financially viable, and having an opportunity, having every clinic be a research site is just not financially viable. Will technology solve that? I don't know. That remains to be seen, I think. I mean, maybe to some degree it will.
I mean, Brad, I know you were talking recently to the guys over at MedVector, and I think that's a really interesting platform they've got going on. I'm looking closely at how they're doing it. I remember a few years ago, everyone was talking about DCT and it was the future. And then we sort of scaled it back a little bit and we said, well, there's going to be a hybrid. Everything's going to be a hybrid. I don't think the traditional site model is ever going to go away completely. That's the truth. But in order to access the number of patients that we have to access, when you look at the number of clinical trials that are activated year over year, this is not slowing down. So I think that the best model is obviously study dependent, but will require us to better incentivize physicians to refer patients. It will require us to consider DCT methodology. It's going to require us to push clinical research into the community. It's going to be a blend of all of the things we talk about, but it's going to be a heavy lift. I don't think anyone's quite figured out how to do this yet. And I think that there'll always be a space for large academic medical centers. I think there's always going to be space for IROs out there. And I think there's always going to be space for SMOs. But it's that unique blend is going to take the industry to pull together and say, how do we do this right? How do we involve everybody?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I think it's going to be a blend of all these things. And we're seeing more experimentation. Obviously, I have a huge interest in the IRO model because it's not dissimilar from what I'm doing and trying to grow with. But I guess, are there disadvantages to doing it this way in your experience? I mean, that's something that aside from having these conversations with like administrators who just don't seem to understand some of what the benefit of being involved in clinical trials are. But Are there any inherent disadvantages to
Yeah,
an IRO model?
So that's a really good question. I think if we take a look at it from the biopharma sponsor perspective, there are sort of two things that jump out to me. The first is that IROs have tended to focus on large multi-specialty, multi-physician practices, but are based around family practice or general practice, internal medicine. Now, unless the biopharma companies are prepared to start thinking seriously about having practitioners that are not board certified in cardiology run cardiology studies, or not board certified in something else running that study, then it's going to cause a problem. The IROs really have to get outside that comfort zone of family practice and start getting into the specialty medicine. And I know that they are making efforts to do that. So that's the first thing. The model works best, or it did work best from the beginning in infectious disease and vaccines. During the pandemic, a lot of the IROs grew up, perhaps by chance, during the pandemic, and then had to pivot in order to sort of maintain business levels after the pandemic ended and start moving into specialty medicine. The other thing that I think jumps off the page to me is that a lot of the physicians, a lot of the practitioners that the IROs are contacting and bringing on board for clinical research have never practiced in research before. So they are, and I hate the term naive investigator. I've never liked to use it because I just don't think it's a fair term. A lot of the providers that IROs are reaching out to have only given that moniker of a naive investigator because they've never been given the opportunity to participate fully in clinical research in the past, but they've wanted to. It's extremely expensive. There's a high bar to entry for a provider to get involved in clinical research and then to continue in clinical research for the second, third, fourth study. We know this. I think the biopharma companies are, and I can say this in the nicest possible way, having worked in biopharma for a lot of my career, the procedures that we go through are lazy. We look to who has performed best most recently on a similar study type, and we go back to those doctors again. That the practitioners that would like to get involved on a first study, especially if it's a phase 2 study or an early phase 3, are not given the opportunity. They're sort of shuffled to the bottom of the pack, and I think that's a real problem. We need to do more as an industry to give providers an opportunity to get involved in their first study, for that study to be a good experience, and for us to facilitate them into the second, third, and fourth studies. After a single study, they're no longer a naive investigator. They're credentialed, they're experienced, they know how to talk to their patients, they know how to do informed consent. And I think one of the plus sides of the IRO model is that they actually do have a very good retention rate of physicians. And they do a nice job of encouraging them to come back for a second study.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are, again, what I found useful about the integrated model. I mean, we have access to every specialist just by virtue of being in a hospital. It's much, I mean, yeah. When I started doing this, I did not want to work with the system. I mean, that was sort of like my whole thing was like, I don't want to get involved with another system. It's a pain in the ass. They don't understand. You're not getting buy-in from the top, which makes it challenging to work from the bottom up. But then I sort of fell into this situation where like we were brought in and championed by a specialist. And then just by virtue of being here, you have access to dozens of specialists across any specialty you can think of, which, again, a huge advantage to being able to sort of bring trials in, diversify what you're able to take. And then while I do agree that it's challenging because you're dealing with essentially a bunch of, lack of a better word, research naive physicians, let's be really honest. Like at the end of the day, what does a sponsor want? They're not going out to find the most experienced physicians. They want access to patients. And if you're in a system, you have access to a crap load of patients probably compared to your local independent practice. So I do think you just lean into potentially a different selling point or some different value. And then, if you're an IRO that's got any kind of, the Javaras and circuit clinicals are well known. So at least the sponsors or CROs can have confidence they're going to be a naive physician will be working with a good team who knows what they're doing. So this is where I really see like this could be a model that really does proliferate like wildly. I don't know why it shouldn't. That's why I've struggled to think about why we're not doing this at a much bigger scale.
And I've wrestled with that too. I see the entry and then the exit of very large players, direct to patient sort of main street stores, CVS most recently, but Walmart as well, sort of getting into this space and then realizing that it's actually a very complicated, very difficult space. What we're lifting here is really heavy. And I think they start to realize that after investing quite heavily in direct to consumer clinical research efforts.
Well, I know we talked about this a little bit offline, I think, but obviously there's a lot of private equity involvement. Do you think these people get in and realize like, oh shit, this is harder than we thought, and maybe the margins aren't as good as we thought they would be? Like, is it inherently not as financially lucrative as companies think? I mean, from what was it Walgreens who exited out of the space? My understanding was they had a bunch of trials and were doing great, but when you really stand back and look at it, it's just not worth it from a bottom line perspective from them. That was sort of my understanding from discussions I had with people that were part of that. Like, is that a problem? Is that going to be a problem going forward? I mean, we're seeing these companies come out, but I mean, everybody's still laying people off. I mean, that's not a great sign. It's something you hate to see. So is it going to become like, oops, this wasn't quite worth what we thought it was?
Yeah, I don't think so. So I'm still a believer in the IRO model. Let me put that out there first. I think that we are nowhere close to the end of IROs. I think they're only going to grow from strength to strength. There's a couple of things though that I would say. The first is, private equity in general, from my understanding, get involved in companies for about 3 to 5 years. They don't like to sign these extremely long-term deals running into the double figures. The IRO model is so new, really relatively new. I think Javara has been 6 years now, just over 6 years. And it's not a model that can be pushed very quickly across the whole country. It just can't be. It needs to grow organically. It needs to grow in a smart way. So I think there is that sort of difference between the rush of return on investment that some of the private equity companies are looking for and the measured approach that the industry would like to take. Hospitals and health systems are notorious in their speed of decision making and their red tape they tie themselves up in. I think biopharma companies have got a lot better, certainly when it comes to executing clinical research, because the timelines that they have to adhere to and the competition that's out there to reach market first is extremely important. But it doesn't translate to the health systems and the hospitals. When you go in, you sit down with the executive teams. They're not in a rush to bring in a third party to do something. They really want to make sure that all the I's are dotted properly. So
I want to say it took 12 to 18 months to get a contract like where I'm at, like just going through, just to get your foot in the door and get started, Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, and I think that actually is fairly quick, When you take that one step further and think about the return on investment for a single site organization, once the site's ready to roll, it's fully staffed up, staff are credentialed and trained, you've got space allocated, you've got equipment bought in, and your business development team at the IRO are going out and seeking out those studies. It can still take 6 to 8 months, perhaps more, to win that first study and get that activated at the site. If it's a difficult to enroll study, you could be looking at 2 or 3 patients in the first couple of months. By the time you actually calculate it out, a return on investment for a new site can take upwards of 2.5 to 3 years in some cases, significantly longer in other cases, depending on the study type or the indication that they're going for. So while we understand that as an industry, and we recognize that, and we plan for that, and we're patient with that, I think it's a world that the private equity organizations are still trying to sort of understand, trying to get their head around. And that isn't speaking from my experience with Javara, just a sort of more general understanding and appreciation of the private equity world and some friends that are very close to it.
It makes sense to me. And maybe to your point, it's more of a matter of the sort of the maturation of the model before it becomes a little bit more stable in terms of what we're seeing. Because I mean, I don't know, it feels very whiplash when you look around and you see a ton of investment, a ton of hiring, a ton of people getting laid off, and then it kind of all back over again. I don't know. It's all very interesting and fascinating to watch. And I know that, I mean, I think Dan, not unlike me, we've done this all sort of bootstrapped, so we don't have the same concerns necessarily as some of these backed. But I think that's part of the beauty too, is it can be done fairly cheap, in my experience, and you don't have to have that push to grow in an unsustainable way. Which again, I think is in some ways the beauty of, we say IRO, in some ways I lump in, integrating within a smaller, private practice. It's the same concept. Of course, maybe it's not as fancy of an acronym you want to put on it, but conceptually it's really not much different. And again, I think part of the beauty is it can be agile and cheap to do that. I wonder if we're overcomplicating, with some of the, as you point out, we like to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a squeeze on both sides, right? You've got on the biopharma side, you've got an industry that haven't fully seen the IRO model working perfectly, and so they're willing to give it a go. And I think IROs are actively building good relationships and strategic partnerships with biopharma companies, and that's what they should be doing. I think there's a desire, generally speaking, in the industry to become what they would consider a sole source provider for a study, for all enrollment. I think that's going to be a pretty heavy lift. I think the biopharma companies are too risk averse to put all their eggs in one basket just yet. So they're going to go with a more blended model. But on the other side of the business, you have got this, you've got to go out, you've got to convince the health systems to allow you to come in as a third party and own a large piece of their research administration world, getting that out into the community. And I think the other message that really resonates well with the hospitals and health system leadership is the need to drive diversity in research. And this is something that I worry becomes a buzzword if we're not careful. But we have seen the FDA start to get much more serious about having a much more representative patient population on every clinical trial. Honestly, I think it's only a matter of time before the guidance document becomes mandatory. And I'm not sure that the industry is quite ready to drive the level of diversity in clinical research that we need to see in order to be successful. I think one way we can do it is to really push out into those community-based practices towards the FQHCs, those underrepresented patient populations, those uninsured patients that are out there. But there's so much more that we need to do than just make it available to them. We have to understand really why they're not getting involved and then address the root cause of the concern. And it's very easy for the three of us, middle-aged white guys, to sit around and have that conversation. But we're not going to solve it between the three of us.
Yeah, probably not. Probably not. Is it maybe a record? This is our first comment after like 40 minutes. If you guys are out there, please feel free to join in here. But kind of back on the private equity part, in this LinkedIn user's opinion, private equity firms don't have the tools or skills necessary to dramatically improve research business. It's not something you can either clear a bunch of fat to reduce spend for, or pour cash in due to increase revenue. I don't know. Is this true in your experience? I do think you can't just throw money at it. We've seen like the level of effort doesn't always change the level of outcome, so to speak. Like you can work real hard on a study and still not enroll anybody. And no matter how much money you put in it, you're not going to enroll more patients. It's not a one-to-one. I've heard the argument that, potentially consolidating in a way to where you could, have a single contract versus 15 or centralized startup. But does that really create enough value at scale? I mean, I'm not so sure it does.
I will say, Brad, I think on the subject of injecting money in and expecting results through no other means is definitely problematic. Let me liken it to this, though. When I first started with Javara 2 years ago, I led the business development team there. I wouldn't consider myself a business developer. I wouldn't consider myself a sales guy in any way. And I think the best way to grow and to support a sales team, a business development team, is to craft the tools to write the value proposition, the mission, to point people in the business developers in the right direction, and then to get out of their way and let them do what they do best. And I think the same is true for private equity. They need to come in, they need to give the industry the tools in order to be able to achieve things. And one of those tools is money, undoubtedly. But then the private equity companies honestly need to get out of the way of the organizations that know this space better than anybody and can run these studies, can activate these sites quickly, can identify the patients, can look for the right technology vendors to partner with. And sort of take a step back and say, we'll provide everything you need, but we don't know this space as well as you do, and we're going to allow you to run. And I think for the most part, the private equity companies, the 25, 30 plus private equity venture capital companies that have been involved in the research space in the last few years have done that. They have allowed the industry to grow at the pace that it needs to grow. I think if they tried to push the industry any quicker, it would backfire. I think that the biopharma companies, in their concerns for risk, would push back a little bit and go back to the models they know best.
Yeah, I can see that. I don't disagree. Sfera, I saw you come off. What do you got?
I mean, once you inject money into something, it lowers efficiency. Like my site, I'm in talks right now to sell my site. We don't need more money to grow. That's not what we need. It'd be nice to get more studies, like, so I don't have to go out and get the studies. But we don't need more money to grow. Like, there's not much more we can grow in a place like Yuma, where the specialists are all owned by the health systems, like I said. And I refuse to go that route because I already know, number one, it's a dead end. Number two, Brad said 12 to 18 months. I don't have that kind of time. I can get, if I just spent that time expanding into another city nearby, under the private model, I can accomplish way more than just waiting around for some large health system to maybe say yes in 2 years. So, but for me, it's kind of cool to potentially be involved. Like, obviously, you take some risk off the table that nobody wants to sell unless the multiples were extremely good. And right now they are, by the way. If you're in the market, you probably already know. But also having a little bit of stock in the parent company, and then having a role there too. Okay, well, maybe now you can expand, San Luis, Arizona, Lake Havasu. To me, that's what's interesting. It's not the injection of cash. We don't need more cash. We're actually sitting on way more cash than we know what to do with, other than giving dividends to the owners, which I don't really want to do. So it's not cash. I know maybe in some markets that's the case, but you do lose a lot of efficiency with the cash, and I think the industry eventually has to answer for this question too.
Well, if you have the cash, then you're pressured to spend it, right?
And what's to prevent you from spending it in the stock market or in real estate? Like, why do you have to reinvest it in this ecosystem? I mean, that's like the business owner's decision at that point. And that's what private equity is looking to do. And ultimately, I believe they're trying to flip it to the next, I call it the greater fool, but it's not really a nice way to phrase it. But ultimately, I think all roads lead to large systems trying to control not just healthcare, but research as well. But I think they're in for a rude awakening when it comes to research. So I do think there's going to be, like Chris says, a value in having a diversity of different types of entities doing studies. I don't think anything will become the dominant player.
What I really think is that there's a temptation when cash is available, when more cash is made available, there's a temptation to just knee-jerk to, let's create another site, let's expand the network. And I think that was honestly a mistake. And that's coming from someone that spent 2 years building a network, and developing new sites and building new partnerships. I have said, before, that unless the model is optimized, all you're doing when you add more sites is you're exacerbating existing operational problems into an additional site. So I think now is a really good time. You talked, Brad, about sort of the ebb and the flow of people going into IROs and then getting laid off. And I think now is a good time for the industry to really take a step back and say, how do we optimize what we've got? What is the model that works best? Who can we partner with to make it better? And then in 6 months, in 9 months' time, we start looking again at growing the networks and expanding in a much more sort of smart way, not just expanding for the sake of expanding.
No, that's a great point. And I wonder about this a lot. I mean, this is stuff I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night, but I definitely, it's damn near it. Like, how do you optimize? Even within a system where the two clinics next door to each other may run completely differently from one another, and you may have to integrate differently, so to speak, even again within the same system. Like, that's extremely challenging. At least I found to be pretty challenging. And then how do you meaningfully scale that? And it feels not scalable. You can grow it, but you can't really scale it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I fear that the next best thing and the low-hanging fruit is to invest in equipment, specialty equipment, and just run up the cost on those things. And if you're the only game in town and you've already established your quality as a site, hey, this is what we charge for an MRI, this is what we charge for a biopsy. So what if it's 5 to 10 times what you're paying everywhere else? Go to those places and do it then. If you want these patients here, this is what you're going to have to pay. And in some of these underserved communities, like you said, diversity is what matters. I think this is the model that's going to be going forward. And what it boils down to is unfair. It's unfair, but pharma's going to have to pay for it. And there's going to be smart people that are able to exploit this arbitrage.
I've never even considered that. So hats off.
They're
for
doing
that
it.
Evil.
They're
Hats
doing
off
it.
for that evil thought.
I would name them now, but I actually
What
like
is that?
them, so I'm not gonna do that to them. But there's people doing that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess, I mean, Chris, you've already kind of hinted at, but what do you think's next for IRAs? It sounds like you think they're going to grow. I don't disagree. I think it's a great concept. Obviously, to your point, I think even in the maybe coming up on close to a decade, we're still not really haven't figured out the secret sauce quite yet. What's next?
So I think in order for the IRO business to be successful and to stand the test of time, it needs to scale. And that's having said everything I've just said about smart growth, backing it off, improving the operational side of things. I do think that if I were to sort of look into a crystal ball, I wonder whether there's not room for a private equity company or a venture capital company to step in and try and consolidate a site management organization with an IRO, which would help expand the IRO model into a much wider footprint than we currently have. Is it risk? Yes, it is. But it also, I think, would boost the confidence in that combined SMO IRO model in the eyes of the biopharma company. And I think they'd start directing more studies and follow-on studies. So you would see, an SMO taking on a phase 1 and then pushing the phase 2, phase 3 work into the side of the business which is handling the IRO side of things. Could I see a CRO also getting involved in that acquisition? Possibly. I think the CROs have been burned before, and I think they've got a long memory when it comes to ownership of sites. It also damages them to some extent when they're talking to major pharma companies about studies they can take on and the scope of what they can do. So I think that's probably slightly behind. I think the first step is some of the larger networks are likely to start adapting more to a more IRO business model, or even acquiring an IRO, or vice versa. The IRO could acquire an SMO to give them scale.
Yeah, I've wondered. Go ahead, Dan.
I was going to say, what if the IRO acquires a failing small CRO? And now a small biotech comes to them and says, hey, here's your survey for your sites. And you say, hey, you know what? Additionally, we have a monitoring layer. And what else do you need? I see that as potentially happening too, because I'm kind of doing it by accident with our boutique CRO, and we've already had like very small sponsors ask us, "Hey, we need rescue sites." Okay, well, do you need rescue CRO? Like, looks like the CRO just abandoned your project. Well, yeah, actually, we do. We do need that. So I do see that as natural. What would that be? Vertical integration.
Yeah, I've wondered this. I mean, even recently, as what, a year or two ago, IQVIA bought up, was it CCT, a fairly decent sized site network. And it's not clear to me if are those successful purchases? Are those net positive for these CROs or not?
I don't think so, but going from the bottom up, it might be successful for the industry.
Yeah.
Maybe pharma gets fed up with the current CRO model and prefers this. Like if these site networks get big enough, these IROs, whatever you call them, hey, we now have a monitoring layer. Everyone uses Creo or real time, so it's really easy to do. Oh, okay, cool, boom, and then you just get those tech vendors to collaborate or partner, give you like some discounted rates, increased efficiency for everyone, and I don't know. It's interesting to follow / participate to some extent.
This industry is nothing if it's not constantly evolving. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And I saw this morning that the Fortreo organization have started to divest specific service offerings that they have. So, I mean, I think that CROs are actually at the forefront, to their credit, of evaluating what is the best industry model that we can go with. How can we slim down our operations, be more effective, be more efficient, and sort of specialize in a specific area. I think 20 years ago it wasn't like that. CROs were just adding services. And
20 years ago, what was like the core competency besides monitoring for a CRO? Hey, we have access to sites. Have you ever seen like the old school clinicaltrials.gov site listings? An Eli Lilly site in Anaheim, a Pfizer site in Oklahoma City. They would keep that, would be guarded. Now that transparency is here and everybody knows all the sites, well, what is the real core competency left? It's no longer hoarding information. It's actually, oh, you got to actually do something. And we're paying you more and you're not doing more things. Like what's going on? You could try to load on ePros that don't work. Like bare bones ePros that they're charging premiums for. All right. They don't invest that money in making a better site experience or a patient experience. But we own this tech. We're going to sell it to you as a premium. And there's no other choice but using this crappy tech. Well, now the sites, if they get big enough, they can change things and be the change they want to see in the world.
Well, I mean, we can only hope, right? Also, let's start an ePro company.
Yeah, I'm down. Let's do it.
All right.
Crappy
All right.
UX, UI, yeah. Easy money.
Perfect. All right. Well, we're getting down to the last few minutes, and I have another meeting, so we're going to jump a little bit early. But any final thoughts, Chris? I want to thank you for coming on. I know it's been a little bit of time in the making, so I appreciate you making the time.
No, I mean, thanks for having me on. I took a look back on some of the previous podcasts that you guys have done, and I got to tell you, there's some great people. There's some great lessons to be learned from this. So, it's been great to watch through a few of those. I look forward to the next ones. I noticed that Kylie is coming on at the end of June. I'm really looking forward to that one. I worked with Kylie for close to 2 years. She is very, very good at what she does and is no nonsense. She tells it straight. And
she's anyone, very passionate about feasibility, for sure.
If anyone can fix feasibility in this industry, I believe Kylie will be at the forefront of it. So I'm looking forward to that one. I will say, in the last 2.5 weeks, since the riff at Javara, the industry has stepped up. I've had it really epitomizes how close-knit and tight and great this industry are. I've had a lot of phone calls from a lot of people, and it's really good. It's a community, and so I want to thank everyone.
You got Kylie shouting out to you right now. What's up, Kylie? Chris Popple for president.
This is a great industry to be in. There's a lot of great people, a lot of really, really smart people that I honestly can't hold a candle to. So let's work together and do what we do better in the future. And this is all part of it. So thanks, Brad, for doing this.
No, of course. Sfera, any final thoughts?
No, I mean, nice to meet you, Chris. I sent a LinkedIn request. Same with you, Kylie. It's always cool to jump on other platforms and meet new people, like a new crowd. It's a little different than what I'm used to, just a little, but it's interesting talk nonetheless. And I am interested in all this futuristic type of things, where the industry is moving and all that stuff. And we actually have a part to play if you want. The beautiful thing about this is once you're in it, you have some say in the matter. Like you can actually change the future with your actions.
It's true. I mean, this is such a, like, I always tell people, it's like a big small world in clinical trials, like, so I mean, to Chris's point, people could sort of look, we disagree about certain things or methods, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to get the same thing accomplished, I think, generally speaking. Some exceptions, but generally speaking. So I'd love being able to have these conversations. So cool, guys, another one in the books. We'll be back next week. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Thanks, Brad. Take care, Dan.